You're in my town now. The Constitution ends at the county line.
Picture this: a dusty Alabama roadside, the kind of heat that shimmers off the asphalt in waves you can actually see, and a white police officer with his chest puffed out, like he just caught the biggest fish in the county, pressing two impeccably dressed black people against the hood of a midnight blue Cadillac Escalade, cuffs clicking into place while his radio crackles with the sound of backup that he absolutely does not need. He is grinning. That grin is the most important detail in this entire story, because that grin tells you everything you need to know about Officer Garrett Pruitt of the Crestfield, Alabama Police Department. A man who has done this exact thing to this exact kind of person in this exact spot more times than he can count, and who has walked away clean every single time. Until today. Because what Garrett Pruitt does not know what he cannot possibly know as he stands there in the Alabama sun feeling like the most powerful man in the state is that the two people he just put in handcuffs are not what they appear to be, and that one phone call from either of them is going to set in motion the complete, total, and utterly irreversible destruction of every corrupt arrangement that has kept Garrett Pruitt comfortable for the last 7 years. This is not just the story of a bad traffic stop, though it is certainly that too, and one of the worst in recent memory at that. This is the story of the most spectacular, most thoroughly deserved, most completely self-inflicted career destruction in the history of one small Alabama county, and you are going to want to stay for every single second of it. Buckle up. Crestfield, Alabama sits roughly 40 miles southeast of Birmingham, in that particular stretch of the state where the interstate narrows to 2 lanes, and the billboards start advertising personal injury lawyers and Baptist churches in roughly equal proportion, which is either a coincidence or a commentary, depending on your mood. The town smells like hot asphalt and cut grass from May through October, and like wood smoke and diesel the rest of the year. And the sound of it on any given weekday is the low, steady hum of a window unit air conditioner fighting a losing battle against the Alabama summer. The distant bark of a dog who has been barking at the same fence post for 11 years, and the occasional 18-wheeler downshifting on the overpass. It is the kind of town where everybody knows everybody's business, mostly because there isn't enough business to keep people from paying attention to each other's. And at the center of all of it, woven into the fabric of Crestfield's daily life, like a thread that had always been there, and that you stopped noticing years ago, was Officer Garrett Pruitt. 47 years old, 22-year veteran of the Crestfield PD buzz cut, gone the color of old snow at the temples, and thinner on top than it used to be, thick in the middle, in the way of a man who once kept himself in shape but decided somewhere around 40 that the effort wasn't worth the result, always in a uniform, half a size too tight across the chest, because he bought his last set 3 years ago and wasn't about to admit he needed a bigger one. He walked like he owned every piece of sidewalk his boots touched, which in his mind he essentially did. Garrett was not known in Crestfield for being a particularly sharp detective, or for solving the kinds of cases that made it into the local paper, or for any of the things that police academies technically train officers to prioritize. And the truth was that he had stopped thinking about those things a long time ago, back when he figured out that being feared was easier than being respected and paid about the same. His badge was not to Garrett Pruitt a responsibility or a privilege or a symbol of public trust, and it had not been those things for a very long time. To Garrett, his badge was a permission slip, permission to move through the world at his own speed, to take up whatever space he wanted, to make decisions about people that those people had no power to appeal, and to do all of it with the full weight of the state of Alabama theoretically behind him. The law was not something Garrett enforced so much as something he weaponized, pointing it at whoever he found inconvenient and pulling the trigger, and the system around him had permitted this for so long that the system itself had started to shape itself around him, bending and accommodating and looking the other way, until the whole arrangement became simply the way things worked in Crestfield. And then there was the money. For the past 6 years, Garrett had been operating what amounted to a side business, a quiet and carefully maintained financial arrangement with the law firm of Hartwell and Dunn, whose billboard a massive sun-faded rectangle featuring the grinning face of Preston Hartwell above the words, "Hurt in an accident, we fight for you," happened to loom directly over Garrett's favorite speed trap on Route 9. The arrangement was elegant in the way that corrupt things often are simple enough to maintain and complicated enough to be difficult to prove. Garrett would identify targets specifically out-of-towners driving expensive vehicles and, more specifically, black drivers in expensive vehicles because Garrett had run this calculation and arrived at conclusions about who was easiest to frighten and who was least likely to be believed in a Crestfield courtroom. And his conclusions had held up for 6 full years without meaningful challenge. He would pull them over, create a narrative of suspicion, sometimes rough the situation up enough to make an arrest feel justified. And then a runner from Hartwell and Dunn would appear at the holding cell with a business card and a sympathetic ear offering to sue the city on the detainee's behalf, promising a fast settlement and splitting whatever came in 3 ways between Hartwell the firm and Garrett Pruitt, who preferred his cut in unmarked envelopes cash on Friday afternoons. Over 6 years, the money had been good and the consequences had been exactly 0, and Garrett had long since stopped being able to distinguish between the law and himself, between what the badge permitted and what he personally wanted, between justice and control. It was a slow Tuesday in July, the kind of day that made boredom feel physical, and boredom in Garrett Pruitt was always a dangerous condition. He was parked behind the Hartwell and Dunn billboard in the gravel turnout he had used so many times. There were permanent ruts from his front tires, the sweet tea in his cup holder gone flat and lukewarm. A long time ago, his eyes moving over the trickle of traffic on Route 9 with the glazed, half-present attention of a man running on habit rather than purpose. He was thinking about whether the gas station down the road had restocked the good beef jerky when the midnight blue Cadillac Escalade rolled past. It was the newest model, the kind of vehicle that costs more than most houses in Crestfield, and that carries itself with a kind of rolling, polished confidence that Garrett could feel in his gut before his brain had finished processing what he was looking at. The sun hitting the paint in a way that made it almost painful to watch every surface gleaming like it had been detailed 20 minutes ago. It was not speeding, the signal was perfect, and when Garrett leaned forward and squinted at the plates, they were Alabama, which meant he couldn't even use the out-of-state angle immediately, but none of that mattered because the details that mattered to Garrett Pruitt were not the details the law required. Through the windshield in the fraction of a second before the angle changed, he could make out the silhouettes, a black man at the wheel, broad across the shoulders, one hand easy and relaxed on the bottom of the steering wheel, the way people drive when they're not nervous, which to Garrett read as arrogance, and a black woman in the passenger seat, hair pulled back tight against her head posture, very straight, looking at something in her lap with the focused attention of someone going over paperwork or a map. Both of them radiating a quality that Garrett Pruitt had always despised without quite being able to name a settled, competent calm, the kind that does not perform itself for the benefit of onlookers, the kind that simply exists because the people carrying it have earned it and know it and don't need Garrett Pruitt's validation of any kind. He decided in approximately 4 seconds and without a single piece of articulable evidence that they were hiding something. This was a reflex, a neural pathway worn so deep by years of unchallenged thinking that it no longer required thought to execute, it simply fired. And the conclusion arrived fully formed. Expensive car, black driver, small Alabama town on a Tuesday. Therefore suspicious. Therefore his business. Therefore a problem he was going to solve. He did not run the plates because he wasn't looking for information. He had already decided what the information would be. He did not wait for a traffic infraction because the infraction would come later, whatever he needed it to be. He put the cruiser in drive and the gravel crackled under his tires as he swung out onto Route 9, and he reached for his radio and told dispatch he was pursuing a suspicious vehicle, possible narcotics involvement, and old Mrs. Landon at the dispatch desk did not ask him for probable cause because in Crestfield she never did. He rode the Escalade's bumper for a quarter-mile, lights strobing in the silent, aggressive threat of someone who has done this enough times to know what the flashing lights alone do to people waiting for them to run or swerve or do anything he could use. And the Escalade did none of those things. It signaled, right moved smoothly to the shoulder near the old First Baptist Church, stopped and sat there quietly with the engine running, and Garrett's smirk arrived on his face with the ease of something that lived there. Gotcha. He checked his dash cam. It was running as required, but he had angled the cruiser the way he always angled it, just slightly off, just enough that the audio would be what he needed it to be if he needed it to be something different later. And then he climbed out and adjusted his belt and let his hand rest on the butt of his sidearm the way he always did. Just resting, just making sure everyone understood the geometry of the situation, and walked up to the passenger side window, which he always preferred because it made people turn their backs to him. He knocked on the glass 3 hard raps, the kind that aren't a request. The window slid down without hesitation. The air that came out when the window dropped was cool and clean and carried the faint specific smell of new leather and absolutely nothing else. No fast food, no cigarette residue, no air freshener trees, no hidden story. And the interior was immaculate in a way that struck Garrett before he could stop it from striking him, though he didn't let the observation settle into meaning. The woman in the passenger seat turned to look at him over the rim of a pair of reading glasses that had been pushed up onto her forehead, and her face was striking in the way of someone who has learned to let very little show while keeping absolute track of everything. Sharp features, a navy blazer over a white shirt, a single thin gold chain at her throat, and eyes that were not afraid of him. The eyes were the thing. Not defiant, not hostile, not performing bravery for the situation, just genuinely, fundamentally, professionally unimpressed the way a surgeon looks at a parking ticket. And it hit Garrett somewhere in the chest before he could redirect it into anger, which he immediately did. The driver, Marcus Voss, was a large man, the kind of large that comes from structure rather than weight broad across the shoulders, with forearms that rested on the wheel and the dash with the relaxed stillness of someone who moves very efficiently when he chooses to move and sees no reason to choose to. Right now, wearing a gray-fitted shirt and a watch that caught the light in a way that said it was not from a department store. Eyes behind his sunglasses pointed straight ahead. One hand on the wheel. Everything about him calibrated and still. Garrett fabricated the reason for the stop the moment the woman asked, which she did in a voice that was precise and articulate and carried no particular regional accent, and what came out of Garrett's mouth was obstructed view of freshener on the mirror, and Marcus Voss glanced at the rear-view mirror with the unhurried attention of a man confirming what he already knew, then looked back at Garrett and said with no heat in it at all that there was nothing on the mirror. Garrett told him not to get smart, and the word he chose to insert before the instruction was boy, and it came out of him the way it always did when someone's calm was making him feel small, easily, almost carelessly, like a reflex rather than a choice. Then the escalation began, and it followed the sequence Garrett had used dozens of times, a choreography of manufactured urgency designed to produce a reaction he could use. He demanded license and registration, and when Marcus reached slowly for the center console, narrating his movement clearly the way people are trained to narrate movements around police to stay safe, Garrett screamed, hands stepping back and dropping his palm to his holster, and the word came out of him like a starter pistol, because that was exactly what it was. Both of them stepped out on his orders, moving with a cooperative deliberateness that was maddening to Garrett because there was nothing in it he could use, and he patted Marcus down with a thoroughness that went several degrees past what the situation called for: waistband, pockets, inner thighs. And what he found was a wallet in the back pocket, which he ripped out and tossed onto the hood of the Escalade without opening it. When he moved to Camille Voss, she stated clearly and without raising her voice that she did not consent to a search, that there was no probable cause, that she was asserting her Fourth Amendment rights. And each of those phrases landed in the Alabama heat like something read from a textbook, which was not an accident. Garrett grabbed her arm anyway, spinning her toward the car, and leaned in close enough that the smell of his stale sweet tea was part of the conversation, and he said something in her ear about the Constitution ending at the county line, and what she did in response was nothing. Not a flinch, not a gasp, just a blink. And then her eyes went back to tracking him with the quiet, thorough attention of someone who is building a record. Marcus and Camille exchanged a look over the hood of the car, and it was not the look of two frightened people communicating their fear. It was the look of two professionals confirming that the situation was unfolding exactly as anticipated and that the protocol was proceeding on schedule, and Garrett couldn't read it, and so he decided it was insolence. He went into the car. He went through the center console, a pack of mint gum, a charging cable, a pair of sunglasses in a hard case. Nothing that helped him. And the glove box gave him insurance papers and a rental agreement from the Hertz counter at Hartsfield-Jackson in Atlanta, which his brain filed immediately under drug runners. Use rentals, a conclusion he'd arrived at years ago and had never revisited. His hand found the hard, cold object under the driver's seat. He pulled it out, and his heart hammered once hard against his ribs. A Sig Sauer P226 matte black, full magazine. The weight of it, solid and real in his hand, and he scrambled back out of the car and held it up in the Alabama sun and screamed, "Gun," the way a man screams fire, and his service weapon was out and leveled at Marcus's chest before the word finished echoing off the church wall. Marcus did not drop to his knees, and he did not raise his hands, and he did not panic. And he said in a voice so level it was almost surreal in the situation that the firearm was legal, and that Garrett should check the leather holder still clipped to the mounting point under the seat, and that everything he needed to understand this was in the wallet on the hood. Garrett radioed for backup and ignored all of it. Deputy Cal Morse arrived first, followed 30 seconds later by rookie Deputy Seth Harlan in a separate cruiser, and Garrett told them both to cuff the suspects, resisting arrest illegal firearm, and Morse hesitated for exactly 2 seconds before following the order, and those 2 seconds would matter later. Marcus announced clearly and loudly for every dash cam in the vicinity that he was a federal agent, that his badge was in the wallet on the hood, and that placing handcuffs on him constituted kidnapping of a federal officer, and Garrett said it was a fake ID, and to cuff him anyway. Camille allowed the cuffs to go on without resistance, and as Deputy Harlan guided her toward the cruiser, her eyes moved steadily and thoroughly over every face, every badge number, every position on the scene, and she was remembering all of it with a specificity that she had been trained to maintain under conditions far worse than a dusty Alabama roadside on a Tuesday afternoon. The back of Morse's cruiser was cramped and smelled of old vinyl and industrial cleaner, the plexiglass divider scratched to near opacity from years of contact with everything that gets transported in the back of police cars, and the heat from the asphalt was coming through the floor in a way that made the air thick and close, even with the front vents running. Marcus Voss sat with his cuffed wrists behind him and his knees pressed against the cage and breathed in the slow, deliberate 4-count rhythm that his Quantico hostage negotiation instructors had drilled into him during a week-long course 11 years ago. 4 counts in hold, for 4 counts out, the technique designed to keep the nervous system from escalating in captivity, and it worked as it always worked, and his heart rate stayed where he needed it. He spoke to Deputy Morse through the divider, the way he had spoken to subjects in crisis situations, not threatening, not pleading, not performing any emotion at all, just laying out facts in the precise, clear language of someone who has given this kind of briefing before and knows which words land and which ones don't. He explained what kidnapping of a federal officer carries under Title 18 of the United States Code, and he explained it not as a threat, but as information being provided in advance so that Deputy Morse could make an informed decision about how he wanted the next hour of his career to proceed. And he used the word accessory twice and the word federal 11 times and the word lawsuit once, and Morse said, "Shut up, you don't talk back there," in a voice that had already lost most of its conviction. In the seat beside Marcus, Camille was doing something different. She was watching Crestfield pass outside the scratched window with the focused inventory-taking attention of someone who had studied satellite images of this town for weeks. and was now seeing it ground level for the first time and confirming what she had expected to find. The Hartwell and Dunn billboard, enormous and sun-faded and grinning, slid past the window, and Camille's eyes tracked it and held it until it was gone, and she filed the image in the same place she was filing everything else. She was not afraid. She was at work. The Sallyport gate rattled up ahead, and the cruiser rolled through, and the gate rattled back down behind them, and the sunlight disappeared, and the heavy mechanical echo of it settling into its frame filled the car like a punctuation mark. Garrett had gotten there first, driving hard to beat his own prisoner transport, and he was already at the booking desk when the Sallyport opened, talking at a volume calibrated to reach every corner of the room, the story building itself in real time. Drug runners, high-level operation, fancy car as a cover, counterfeited federal IDs. So convincing, he almost didn't catch it. Concealed weapon and a rental car from Atlanta. This was a big one, Everett, a real collar. Desk Sergeant Wally Pruitt, who shared Garrett's last name by pure regional coincidence. The two men, not related in any way they'd ever been able to determine, sat behind the booking counter with 30 years written into the lines of his face and a toothpick moving slowly from one side of his mouth to the other, and listened to Garrett talk with the expression of a man whose instincts have served him too long to be overridden by someone else's enthusiasm. When Marcus and Camille were marched in through the Sallyport door by Morse and Harlan, the room changed. It was not anything dramatic. No one said anything. No music played, but the room changed in the way rooms change when the people walking into them carry themselves a specific way, and both of the Voss siblings walked in with their hands behind their backs and their chins level and their eyes moving, and the booking room of the Crestfield Police Department was clearly not a place that intimidated them in any way that they were making any effort to conceal. Camille stated her full name, her title, and the specific federal statute. Title 18 United States Code Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law, with the precise, unhurried diction of someone who has spoken these words before and will speak them again and knows exactly where each one needs to land. Garrett laughed at this, the way he always laughed at people who quoted the law at him, and then he ordered a strip search. Officer Dana Pruitt, who had been standing near the far wall filling out a form when they came in, put her pen down on the counter and turned around and said, "No." Not with anger, not with apology, just flatly. The way you say no to something that doesn't require discussion. And she said she was not going to strip search a woman in a blazer who sounded like a federal prosecutor because Garrett had a hunch, and she said it clearly enough that everyone in the room could hear it, and so that it would be in her memory when she needed it. Garrett turned the color of old brick and said the word insubordination, and Chief Roy Dunbar walked into the room. Dunbar was the kind of man who had run Crestfield's police department for 14 years by knowing exactly how much weight each of his officers was worth and exactly when each one was becoming a liability. A pragmatic calculation that had kept the department functional and kept a great many uncomfortable things from requiring formal examination. And he had protected Garrett Pruitt specifically because Garrett was effective at the things Dunbar needed done and had never before made a problem this loud. He picked up Marcus's badge from the counter where Garrett had thrown it, and he turned it over in his hands, and his thumb ran over the engraving, and his expression shifted the way the expression of a very experienced man shifts when a situation stops being manageable and becomes something else entirely. The badge was solid brass, the enamel perfect, and embedded in the back was a microchip that Dunbar recognized because it was the same kind of chip that accessed the federal building in Birmingham, where he'd once attended a conference, and nobody puts a federal access RFID chip in a novelty badge. He looked at Marcus and asked quietly who he was. Marcus gave his full name and his title, Special Agent in Charge FBI, Atlanta Field Office, and then he said that if the handcuffs were not removed in the next 10 seconds, Chief Dunbar would spend the remainder of his career managing the legal consequences of this moment, and the delivery was so calm and so specific that it landed not as a threat, but as a weather forecast. Dunbar told Sergeant Pruitt to run the badge number, and Garrett said, "It's fake, Chief, don't run it." It's a fake in the voice of a man who has realized he is running out of runway, and the system took 40 seconds to return a result, and when it did, Sergeant Pruitt read the screen and set the toothpick on the counter and did not pick it up again. Then Garrett drew his taser. Deputy Morse drew his sidearm 3 seconds later and pointed it at Garrett and told him to put the taser down, and the room was in a standoff that nobody in it had planned for, and that none of them had any training for, and Marcus Voss asked for his cell phone from the plastic bin on the counter, and when no one moved to stop him, he reached over the counter himself calmly and took it. He dialed a number from memory, and he put the call on speaker, and the ring echoed off the concrete walls once, and then a woman's voice answered, and Garrett heard the word director's office and felt something shift permanently in his body. Marcus said his name, said code red. Crestfield, Alabama. Said he and his partner had been illegally detained and disarmed by local law enforcement, said he needed the team currently holding at the perimeter to move in now. The voice said, "Sit tight, Malik, they're 90 seconds out." Marcus ended the call and looked at Garrett Pruitt, and what was on Marcus Voss's face was not triumph, and it was not anger. It was the specific professional expression of a man watching a situation resolve itself exactly as he had designed it to resolve. The 90 seconds lasted approximately 11 years inside the Crestfield Police Station booking room. Nobody spoke. The officers who had been on Garrett's side of the room 40 minutes ago had moved without discussion to the far wall, the instinct for self-preservation operating below the level of conscious thought, putting as much visible distance between themselves and Garrett Pruitt as the room allowed. And Garrett was standing alone near the filing cabinet with his taser holstered and his arms at his sides, and the expression of a man who has begun to understand the size of what he has stepped into, but cannot yet make himself admit it fully. Camille had produced a small spiral notebook from the interior pocket of her blazer and was writing in it with a ballpoint pen, her handwriting fast and precise, and every 15 seconds or so she would look up at Garrett, take in something specific about his posture or his position or his face, and then look back down and write something else. Garrett asked in a voice that was trying to sound contemptuous and landing somewhere around pleading what she was writing. Without looking up from the notebook, Camille told him she was writing his indictment, and she added that the threatened strip search had just added 5 years to the count, specifically referencing the statute number. And then she looked up at Officer Pruitt and asked her to confirm what she had heard, and Officer Pruitt said yes, and confirmed it, and said she would testify to it. Garrett called her a traitor. The word sat in the room for a moment, and then Officer Pruitt looked at Garrett directly and said that she wasn't a traitor, that she just wasn't willing to go to federal prison for a man who had never once in 8 years done anything for her career except make it more complicated, and then she went back to watching the door. The coffee mug on Sergeant Pruitt's desk began to vibrate. It was subtle at first, a faint tremor, the surface of the coffee shivering in tiny concentric rings, and then the vibration moved up through the floorboards into the soles of everyone's shoes, and the sound arrived a second later, low and rhythmic and growing thwop thwop thwop, the particular frequency of a helicopter rotor that registers not just in the ears but in the chest cavity. Garrett moved to the window. The helicopter was there. Alabama State Police markings, and below it on Main Street, the sirens were beginning to arrive, not one, not two, a sustained overlapping chorus of them coming from at least 4 directions, and it sounded like the town was being surrounded, because it was. The Sallyport gate rolled upward, and the Alabama afternoon flooded in through the opening, blindingly bright after the fluorescent half-dark of the booking room, and standing in that brightness in a line of 6 were federal agents in full tactical gear with AR-15s at low ready, and the yellow letters FBI across their chests in a font that was designed to be read under exactly these conditions. And they moved inside with the quiet, fluid economy of people who have done this hundreds of times and who are operating completely within their comfort zone. Behind them walked Assistant Director Simone Hargrove in a charcoal gray suit with her hands clasped in front of her and her face carrying the particular expression of a federal official who has already written the first draft of the press release. In her head, no urgency, no excitement, just the cold, organized momentum of someone who is here to do a specific job and intends to have it done correctly. She looked at the room the way you look at a crime scene, which is what it was. The tactical team swept the booking area in 12 seconds. Everyone's hands up now, and every officer in the Crestfield Police Department raised their palms toward the ceiling. Sergeant Pruitt Morse, Harlan Pruitt, and Garrett Pruitt last. And the gesture from Garrett looked like surrender because it was. The agents went straight to Marcus and Camille, bypassing everyone else, and confirmed they were uninjured and that the situation was contained. And Marcus stood up and straightened his shirt and said, "Yes, thank you." The situation was contained with the matter-of-fact calm of someone wrapping up a meeting. Assistant Director Hargrove moved to Chief Dunbar and said without ceremony that he was relieved of command, effective immediately, that the Alabama State Bureau of Investigation was assuming operational control of the Crestfield PD and that the building was now a federal crime scene. And Dunbar looked at her for a moment and then looked at the floor and said, "Understood," in the voice of a man who has been waiting for a knock at the door for a long time. Then Marcus turned to Garrett. He said it quietly, not for the room, but for Garrett specifically. And what he said was that the Escalade was a federal vehicle that he and Camille had been in Crestfield for 11 weeks before today, and that the stop had not been a surprise, that everything Garrett did on that roadside was captured on equipment far more reliable than the Crestfield PD's temperamental dash cam, including the things Garrett said when he thought the audio was off. And then Marcus told him what had been found in a court-authorized search of Garrett's personal truck that morning before the stop, while Garrett was sitting behind the billboard drinking flat sweet tea, a handwritten ledger, spiral-bound, the kind you buy at a drugstore, sitting in a lockbox under the back seat containing 7 years of names, dates, cash amounts, and notation codes that Garrett apparently thought were cryptic and that the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had decoded in 4 hours. Hartwell and Dunn was in the ledger. Chief Dunbar was in the ledger. Garrett's name appeared on every other page. The room understood all at once that Garrett Pruitt was not a bad cop who had made a bad stop. He was the target, had been the target, and the midnight blue Escalade on Route 9 had been bait, and he had taken it with both hands and a smile. Assistant Director Hargrove looked at Marcus, and Marcus gave a single small nod, and Hargrove turned to the tactical team and said 2 words. 2 agents moved to Garrett from either side, and they were not gentle about it. They took his arms and turned him toward the wall and kicked his feet apart in a wide, deliberate stance, mirroring with clinical precision exactly what Garrett had done to Marcus Voss on the shoulder of Route 9 less than 2 hours ago, and the symmetry of it was not lost on anyone in the room who was paying attention, which was everyone. Garrett said, "I was just doing my job," and they looked suspicious, and it was a good stop, and each sentence came out smaller than the one before it, and no one in the room responded to any of them. Marcus walked over as the agents were moving Garrett toward the door, and he stopped close enough to speak quietly. And what he said was not angry, and it was not triumphant. It was specific and informational, the way he said everything, and he told Garrett exactly what the next 6 months of his life were going to look like, how many counts were in the indictment, approximately how many years were being discussed in the U.S. Attorney's Office that morning, and the name of the federal facility where the case was likely to land. Garrett spit. It was a small, ugly gesture from a man who had run out of everything else, and Marcus wiped his cheek with the back of his hand and looked at Garrett for one more moment, and then told the agents to take him out, and they did. Outside the Sally Port, through the tinted window of the federal transport, Garrett could see the media vans arriving on Main Street satellite dishes, extending cameras, pointing reporters in blazers, speaking into microphones with the Crestfield Police Department sign visible over their shoulders. And the FBI had not brought the press with them exactly, but they had not discouraged them either, because the story of a corrupt small-town officer accidentally arresting the FBI is the kind of story that tells itself and that the public deserves to hear. Back in the booking room, Camille clipped her badge onto her belt and picked up her notebook and her phone, and looked at Marcus, and Marcus picked up his own badge and looked at Deputy Morse and Deputy Harlan, who were standing in the corner in the particular posture of 2 people who would very much like to be invisible. He walked over to them, and they both flinched slightly, and Marcus told them to relax, that he knew who the bad apples were, and they were not among them, but that standing by while federal officers were illegally detained was not a nothing, and that the decision they made in the next 24 hours about whether to cooperate fully and voluntarily with the investigation was going to determine whether they kept their badges and their freedom or lost both. And then he gave each of them a card and walked away. 6 months is enough time for the initial shock of an arrest to wear off and be replaced by something heavier and more permanent, and by the time Garrett Pruitt was seated at the defendant's table in courtroom 4A of the Hugo L. Black Federal Building in Birmingham, the shock had been gone for a long time, and what was left was a kind of gray, grinding dread that lived in his chest from the moment he woke up each morning on the detention center's thin mattress. The orange jumpsuit was 2 sizes too tight across the shoulders, which was different from the way his uniform used to be, too tight. The uniform was too tight because he refused to acknowledge the weight. The jumpsuit was too tight because it was the size they had and he didn't get to choose, and he had lost weight in the 6 months of detention. The gym-absent softness around his middle beginning to deflate in a way that made him look not thinner, but diminished, like something that had been let out of a container it needed. The swagger was gone in the way that a habit goes when the environment that sustained it no longer exists. Garrett Pruitt sat in his chair at the defendant's table and looked like a man who had been carrying a very specific, very heavy thing for 22 years and had recently set it down and discovered that without it, he did not know how to stand up straight. The gallery was full, every seat taken standing room at the back, and in the front row, Marcus and Camille Voss sat side by side in suits that fit them, the way suits fit people who have worn them, in rooms where things matter. And they were not there to observe, but to participate, and the room was aware of this distinction. Behind them, the national press occupied the next 4 rows because the story had gone everywhere. The dash cam footage had leaked in the 3rd week after the arrest, appearing first on a local Birmingham news site and then on every platform simultaneously. And the audio of Garrett saying "boy" to a senior FBI special agent had become one of those cultural moments that people reference by date, the way you reference storms. The comment sections were extensive. Judge Adaeze Okafor entered, and the room stood, and her reputation had arrived before her. She was known in the federal legal community as someone who managed her courtroom with the kind of precision that made lawyers prepare more carefully than they would for anyone else, and who had absolutely no patience for theater from either side. Garrett's court-appointed defense attorney, Mr. Fielding, was a man who had taken harder cases than this one and won some of them, but who had reviewed the discovery file in this particular matter and understood with professional clarity that winning was not the operative goal. Here, limiting the damage was the operative goal, and even that was going to be extremely difficult. The Hartwell and Dunn law firm had not returned Garrett's calls since the 3rd day of his detention, and Preston Hartwell was in a separate federal holding facility in Montgomery, also not available for calls. U.S. Attorney Patricia Osei stood at the prosecution table, a woman whose reputation for preparation was so thorough that other attorneys in the Northern District described her as someone who memorizes the discovery the way other people memorize song lyrics, completely permanently and in a way that is always available when she needs it. The suppression hearing opened with Fielding arguing that the dashcam audio had been altered, that the stop was within established protocols, and that Marcus Voss had provoked the confrontation in a way designed to entrap a local officer acting in good faith. And the argument was coherent and clearly prepared, and sounded increasingly thin against the weight of everything else in the room. Patricia Osei stood confirmed that the dashcam metadata was clean and verified by the FBI's Digital Forensics Laboratory, and then she said she had a surprise witness, and Garrett's jaw tightened in a way that did not go unnoticed by the court reporter. Preston Hartwell came through the back doors of the courtroom looking like a version of himself that had been washed too many times. The billboard confidence was gone. The good old boy ease was gone. The practiced smile was gone. And what walked to the witness stand was a man who had made a calculation about his own future and had arrived at cooperation as the only viable answer, and who was here to honor that calculation as completely and as quickly as possible. He did not look at Garrett Pruitt once from the time he entered the room until the time he left it. Patricia Osei gave him very little room to wander, and he didn't try to. He answered each question with the efficiency of someone who has been over this material many times with federal prosecutors in preparation sessions, and who understands that brevity and directness are the only things left in his control. He confirmed that Garrett had been on his informal payroll for 7 years, that the arrangement was structured around Garrett, identifying and stopping out-of-towners, and that the targets were not random. He said Garrett's words to him, words Hartwell had heard directly on multiple occasions across multiple years, to the effect that black drivers in expensive cars from out of state were the preferred targets because in Garrett's own framing, juries in Crestfield would take a white officer's word over theirs without a second thought, and the arrangement depended on that calculation being correct, and for 7 years it had been. He confirmed the mechanics, the stop the detention, the Hartwell and Dunn runner appearing at the holding cell, the offer to sue the city, the settlement, the split. He gave the jury the numbers. 34 documented stops over 7 years, all black drivers, all in out-of-state or high-value vehicles, all resulting in retainer agreements with Hartwell and Dunn, all settled out of court for amounts ranging from $18,000 on the low end to $140,000 on the high, and the total amount that had flowed to Garrett Pruitt over those 7 years was $378,000 in cash in unmarked envelopes on Friday afternoons, and every dollar of it was documented in the ledger. The gallery did not erupt, so much as shift a collective exhalation and repositioning the sound of people absorbing something larger than they had prepared themselves for, and Judge Okafor gavelled once, not for silence, but for steadiness to hold the room in place, long enough for the weight of what had just been said to settle. Garrett's hands under the table had stopped being still. Mr. Fielding did not cross-examine Preston Hartwell because there was nothing in Hartwell's testimony that he could attack without making it worse, and the decision to simply sit down and let the testimony stand was the most honest legal judgment Fielding made in the entire proceeding. Fielding put Garrett on the stand on the 3rd day, and there was a logic to it that was not entirely wrong. Garrett Pruitt had spent 22 years talking his way through situations, constructing narratives in real time, and delivering them with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged. And the theory was that perhaps on the stand with that specific skill set, he could introduce enough reasonable doubt to matter. The theory was wrong, but Fielding was working with what he had. Garrett straightened when he sat down, and something of the old posture came back. The chin up, the shoulders squared, the deliberate settling of his weight into the chair that communicated ownership. And for the first few minutes of Fielding's direct examination, talking about his service record and his years on the force and his knowledge of the Route 9 corridor, he sounded like a man who still believed the story he was telling. Patricia Osei let Fielding finish, and then she approached the podium with nothing in her hands, which was a choice. And she began with questions so straightforward that Garrett's confidence began to return in small increments. How long had he been patrolling Route 9? What were his criteria for initiating a traffic stop? Had he received training in identifying narcotics? Trafficking indicators? All of it familiar territory. All of it answered with the fluency of habit. Then the floor shifted. She produced the metadata analysis from the dashcam system, a single document 2 pages clean. Columns, and walked Garrett through it with the patience of someone who understands that juries need time with numbers, and what the metadata showed was that Garrett had activated his emergency lights at a moment when the Escalade was already 43 yards past his position, which meant that whatever visual observation he claimed to have made about the rearview mirror was physically impossible at that distance and angle. The obstructed view story was gone. She produced the Hertz post-rental inspection report completed by a company employee 3 hours before the stop, which documented the vehicle's interior condition in the standardized language of rental car inspections. No odors detected, interior clean. No indication of contraband or unauthorized items. and she read the relevant line into the record and asked Garrett to reconcile his testimony about smelling marijuana with a documented inspection finding that the vehicle had no odors 3 hours prior. Garrett said inspections weren't always thorough. She produced the forensic analysis of the Sig Sauer P226, which confirmed that the weapon's serial number was registered to the FBI Atlanta field office, that the leather mounting bracket still physically attached to the gun when Garrett pulled it from the vehicle was a standard-issue federal law enforcement holster bracket, and that the bracket was visible and identifiable at a distance of 18 inches in adequate light conditions. Garrett said he was focused on the weapon and not on what was attached to it. She said nothing for 3 seconds, which in a federal courtroom is a long time, and then she asked Garrett one final question, and she asked it without notes. Looking at him directly, she asked him to describe in his own words the first thought he had when the Escalade passed his position on Route 9, before the plates before the window, before any information he could have observed from his vehicle had been processed. What was the first thing Garrett Pruitt thought when he saw that car? Garrett opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again, and what came out was not an answer to the question, and everyone in the room knew it was not an answer to the question, and the 12 people in the jury box were watching his face with the focused, unhurried attention of people who have already arrived somewhere and are simply waiting for the record to catch up. Patricia Osei said no further questions and returned to her table, and the silence she left behind was the most devastating thing that had happened in the courtroom in 3 days of devastating things. The jury was back in 2 hours and 50 minutes, which included a lunch break, and the verdict on each count was delivered in the flat procedural cadence of a jury foreperson who has done this before and understands that the words carry enough weight on their own without additional inflection. Guilty deprivation of rights under color of law. Guilty conspiracy to commit extortion, 34 counts. Guilty filing false police reports, multiple counts. Guilty assault on federal officers. Guilty hate crime enhancement applied to the underlying traffic stop. Garrett sat through the reading with the stillness of a man whose body has decided that movement is no longer useful. And when the last count was read and Judge Okafor thanked the jury and the gallery noise rose briefly and then quieted, he looked at his hands on the table in front of him and said nothing. 2 weeks later for sentencing, the courtroom was full again. Judge Okafor did not use many words, but the words she used were chosen with the care of someone who understands that they will be quoted. And she spoke directly to Garrett about what a badge is supposed to mean, about the specific weight of the promise made when it is pinned on the promise to protect people from exactly the kind of harm that Garrett Pruitt had spent 7 years inflicting, and she said that the particular betrayal of a corrupt officer was different from other corruptions because it weaponized the one institution that vulnerable people are supposed to be able to turn to for safety, and that courts have a responsibility to respond to that betrayal with a sentence that reflects its actual severity. She sentenced Garrett Pruitt to 28 years in the Federal Correctional Institution at Tallapoosa with no eligibility for parole, and she named the specific federal statutes under which each portion of the sentence was calculated. And when the last number was read, the gavel came down with a sound that Garrett would hear in his sleep for years. The U.S. Marshals turned him around to move him toward the holding area, and Garrett looked back at the gallery one time, and in the back row, standing with his hands relaxed and clasped behind him in a posture that the military calls parade rest, was Marcus Voss. And Marcus was looking at Garrett with an expression that held no cruelty and no celebration, just the steady, professional acknowledgement of a completed mission, and he gave Garrett a single slow nod. The heavy door closed. The week following sentencing felt different from the arrest week. The arrest had been fast and loud and cinematic, the kind of thing people in Crestfield would describe to their grandchildren. But the week of the full federal action was quieter and more thorough, and in some ways more frightening because it was so organized, and organized things that move quietly and completely tend to leave less behind. Monday morning, a convoy of vehicles rolled down Main Street at 715 SUVs and vans, and one large truck with government plates and they did not stop at the police station, which had been under interim state management since the night of the arrest and which had already been substantially searched. They went to the sources. The offices of Hartwell and Dunn occupied the second floor of a brick building on Commerce Street that Preston Hartwell had decorated with his own face in 3 separate framed photographs, and the FBI agents who came through the door with the warrant were polite and efficient and methodical, and within 4 hours the complete financial records of 7 years of settlements, every one of the 34 victims identified, every dollar traced, every split documented in the ledger, and confirmed against the firm's own accounts, were in federal custody, and a restitution process had been formally opened. At City Hall, Chief Roy Dunbar was at his desk when they arrived, which said something about him that his lawyers would later try to use. He had not fled, had not shredded, had simply come to work and waited. And when the agents came through the door, he looked up and put his pen down and said, "I've been expecting you," in a voice that had no fight left in it. And the charges he faced: obstruction of justice conspiracy, and 6 counts of filing falsified internal affairs reports that had buried complaints against Garrett over the years, did not surprise him, because he had known for a long time that this accounting was coming and had simply chosen not to think about when. The image that ran on every news service in the state, and many national ones, was of Circuit Judge Henderson Vale, a man who had been signing blank warrant forms for Garrett Pruitt for 5 years, filling in the probable cause section after the fact, with language provided by Garrett being placed in handcuffs on his front porch in his bathrobe at 6 in the morning, a shredder visible through the open door of his home office behind him still running. The image of a sitting judge in a bathrobe being arrested on his own porch became the defining photograph of the Crestfield case, the one that appeared on magazine covers and above newspaper fold lines, the one that communicated without a single word what had been allowed to grow inside one Alabama county for the better part of a decade. The 34 identified victims received certified letters. The letters went to addresses in Georgia, Tennessee, Mississippi, and 3 other states, and a federal restitution fund was established and funded, and the process of returning what had been taken was begun. Deputy Morse surrendered voluntarily at the Birmingham Federal Building, and his testimony filled in the final gaps, and he received a reduced sentence and a permanent bar from law enforcement, and he accepted both conditions without argument because he knew they were fair, and because he was fundamentally a man who had stood by when he should not have, and who understood that standing by is a choice with consequences. Officer Dana Pruitt received a formal commendation for her refusal to carry out the strip search order, and she stayed on the Crestfield force under the interim state administration, and several months later she was appointed to the newly formed Civilian Oversight Board, the first in Crestfield's history, which met on the first Thursday of every month in the town hall meeting room that used to be used for storage. The Federal Correctional Institution at Tallapoosa is not a particularly large or particularly famous prison, but it is a real place where real time passes in the particular way that time passes in institutions designed to hold people still while the world moves without them. Garrett arrived on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate, transported in a van with 4 other federal prisoners, his wrists in steel cuffs attached to a chain that ran to his ankle restraints, and the intake process was not cruel, but it was thorough, and it was designed to communicate something specific about the transition from one kind of existence to another. Everything that had defined him on the outside was removed or replaced. The clothes, the belt, the boots, and what he was given in exchange was a gray uniform with a number stenciled across the back. And the number was not a code or a nickname, but simply his administrative designation in a system that processes thousands of people and does not have time for the kind of individuality that Garrett Pruitt had spent 47 years insisting upon. The walk from intake to his housing unit was long enough to establish that the population was aware of who he was, because news in a federal prison travels with a speed and thoroughness that would impress most journalists, and former police officers occupy a specific and permanent social position at the absolute bottom of the institutional hierarchy, and former police officers who have been on national news occupy that position with an extra weight of notoriety that makes everything harder. His cell was 8 by 10 feet of poured concrete, a mattress that was 2 inches of foam over a metal platform, a small high window that showed a square of sky that changed color with the seasons, and was the main way Garrett tracked time in the early months, and a metal toilet sink combination that hummed faintly when the building's plumbing system pressurized in the morning. The daily texture of the place was specific and grinding, and entirely unlike anything Garrett's imagination had prepared him for, because the thing that was hardest was not the danger or the discomfort. It was the sheer volume of identical hours that arrived and had to be filled and passed and endured. 11 cents an hour in the cafeteria, serving line, a common room television. He didn't control a shelf of paperbacks with their covers torn off. And late one night, in the specific darkness of a prison cell at 2 in the morning, when the housing unit had settled into its nighttime sounds, the distant clanking, the occasional shout, the steady breath of the man in the next cell. Garrett lay on his back and looked at the concrete ceiling and thought about the escalade, not with anger, not with the comfortable story he had been telling himself for months about being set up or being targeted or being made an example, just with the plain, undecorated honesty of a man with nowhere left to hide from his own thoughts. He thought about the moment the car passed his position on Route 9 before anything, before he touched the radio, before he formed any justification at all. And what he found when he looked at that moment clearly was that the first thing he had felt was not suspicion, not a trained law enforcement instinct, but something simpler and uglier and entirely his own. He had seen a black man in a car that cost more than Garrett's house, and he had decided that was wrong, and he had gone to correct it. He had never in 22 years asked himself that question clearly enough to see the answer. He saw it now. It didn't make things right, and it didn't change anything about what was coming, but it was true. And it was the most honest thing Garrett Pruitt had thought in a very long time. 3 months after sentencing on a Thursday in October, the Department of Justice held a ceremony in the main conference room of the Robert F. Kennedy Building in Washington. Not one of the large ceremonial spaces, just a conference room with good lighting and folding chairs and a podium with the DOJ seal. The kind of setting that communicates that the thing being recognized is the work itself and not the performance of recognizing it. The Attorney General spoke briefly about the Crestfield case, about the methodology it had established for identifying and prosecuting institutionally embedded corruption in local law enforcement, about the 34 families who had received restitution letters, about the way the case had moved through the courts. And then he called Marcus and Camille Voss forward and presented them each with the Attorney General's Award for Distinguished Service. Marcus accepted his without a speech, thanking his team with the specific names of the 12 people who had worked the Crestfield investigation for 11 weeks, and Camille did the same. And neither of them said anything about themselves, which was accurate to who they were. In the parking garage afterward, walking toward the government SUV, Camille asked if Marcus thought Garrett was watching the news. Marcus thought about it for a moment, actually considered it, and said yes, probably because there wasn't much else to do with a 28-year sentence in Alabama than watch the news. She asked if he felt sorry for him. Marcus opened the passenger door for her and then walked around to the driver's side and got in and started the car before he answered. And what he said was careful and honest, and without performance, that he didn't feel sorry for Garrett Pruitt, that the sentence was correct and the process was fair and the outcome was what the outcome needed to be, but that the people he thought about, the people who occupied space in his mind when he let himself think about Crestfield, were not Garrett, but the 34 people who had crossed Garrett's path before Marcus and Camille did, the ones who had been frightened and humiliated and arrested and extorted, and who had no badge to pull from a wallet, who had only their word against a white cop in a southern county, and who for years had that word valued at exactly nothing. Those were the people who deserved the apology that no one was going to give them, and the restitution letters were not an apology. They were an acknowledgement and a partial correction, which is all the system can actually do, and Marcus knew the difference. Camille pulled out her phone and opened a new case file, and Marcus read the summary over the center console while the car was still in park, and he put the SUV in reverse without saying anything else, and they pulled out of the garage into the clean October afternoon. 6 weeks after his arrival at FC, Tallapoosa, Garrett Pruitt received a piece of mail, which was the first piece of mail he had received since the sentencing, his family having settled into a silence he understood was permanent and that he did not try to break. The envelope had no return address, and the handwriting on the front was his ex-wife's, which he recognized from 21 years of Christmas card envelopes and grocery lists left on the kitchen counter. And he looked at it for a long moment before he opened it, sitting on the edge of his bunk in the thin afternoon light from the high window. There was no note inside. There was only a single photograph printed on plain white paper, the way you print something at a drugstore photo counter, showing the corner of Route 9 and Main Street in Crestfield, specifically the spot where the Hartwell and Dunn billboard used to stand, and the billboard was gone. The frame still there, the bare metal catching the Alabama sun, and someone had attached a temporary banner to the crossbeam white background, clean black letters, Crestfield Community Justice Fund applications now open. Garrett held the photograph and looked at it. He looked at it for longer than he had looked at anything since the day the gavel came down in Birmingham, sitting very still on the edge of the foam mattress with the photograph in both hands. And what moved through him was not grief exactly and not regret exactly. It was something closer to the recognition of a specific, permanent, irreversible consequence, the way you recognize it when you finally stop arguing with it. He folded the photograph carefully, with more care than the situation seemed to require, and he slid it under the mattress. He did not put it there to look at it again, and he did not put it there to hide it. He put it there because the floor of a prison cell is not a place for the only honest communication he had received since the arrest, and because some part of him that had not yet finished accounting for things needed it nearby. On a Sunday afternoon in late autumn, a family from Atlanta came through Crestfield on the way to visit relatives in Montgomery, the father driving, the mother navigating from her phone, 2 kids in the back with headphones. And when the Welcome to Crestfield sign appeared at the edge of the highway, the father's eyes went automatically to the rearview mirror. Old reflex, the kind that black drivers on southern highways develop without choosing to the kind that lives below the level of deliberate thought. The mirror showed an empty road. He exhaled a breath he hadn't fully realized he was holding, and his right hand relaxed on the wheel, and his daughter in the back said, "Dad, you okay?" And he said, "Yeah, baby, I'm good." And he was. The gravel turnout behind where the billboard used to be was empty, a patch of weeds beginning to reclaim the tire ruts, the bare metal frame of the sign structure catching the light without anything to say. Just a frame, just aluminum, just the outline of something that used to be there. At the Crestfield Municipal Building on 3rd Street, a corkboard in the lobby held a notice about the Civilian Oversight Committee meeting on the first Thursday of every month, and listed Officer Dana Pruitt as the police liaison, and the attendance line at the bottom noted that the most recent meeting had drawn 47 people, which was more than any civic meeting in Crestfield's recorded history had ever drawn before. And in Macon, Georgia, a woman named Gloria Treadwell, who had been pulled over on Route 9 4 years earlier, roughed up, detained for 6 hours on charges that were quietly dropped, and who had been too afraid and too certain of the futility to file a formal complaint, had received a certified letter 8 weeks after the sentencing, and she had sat at her kitchen table and read it 3 times before she believed what it said. The letter acknowledged in the formal language of the United States government that she had been wronged by an officer of the Crestfield Police Department in a stop that was conducted without probable cause, motivated by bias, and in violation of her constitutional rights, and it used the word sorry not in the hedging liability cautious way that institutional apologies usually deploy that word, but directly in the first sentence before anything else. The check for $62,000 was behind the letter, But it was the word sorry that made Gloria Treadwell put her hand over her mouth and sit at that table for a long time. Not crying exactly, but releasing something, some specific heavy thing that had been lodged in her chest since the night on Route 9, when a man with a badge had made her feel like her rights were a joke he was in on, and she wasn't. And what she felt releasing was not happiness, but something rarer and more important, which was the specific physical sensation of being believed. Garrett Pruitt is currently in year 1 of a 28-year sentence at FCY Tallapoosa, where he will be 75 years old on the earliest date that a release could theoretically be considered, and the pension he paid into for 22 years was forfeited under federal law, and the house and the truck and the accounts were seized under civil asset forfeiture proceedings, and the thing that Garrett believed made him powerful, the badge, the belt, the 22 years of accumulated authority in one small county, turned out to be the very instrument that made everything he built accountable. And that accountability arrived on schedule, the way it always does when you've been building on the wrong foundation long enough. Marcus and Camille Voss continue to work not in the visible medal ceremony way, but in the way the work actually gets done. Files, warrants 11-week investigations in towns that nobody outside those towns has heard of. Following the money and the pattern and the paper trail to wherever it leads, and then doing it again, because there is no shortage of towns. And there is no shortage of the specific kind of official who has decided that the law is something other people live under, and someone has to know where to find them and how to make it stick. Every person in this story made a choice at some specific moment. Garrett chose to see a threat where there was a person. Morse chose silence until the moment he couldn't any longer. Pruitt chose to refuse an order that she knew was wrong, even knowing what refusing would cost her in that room. Marcus and Camille chose the slow, unglamorous, invisible road to justice, rather than the loud one. And what the story of Crestfield really comes down to is that every one of those choices had a consequence, large or small, immediate or delayed, and that none of them were made in a vacuum, and that the question the story leaves behind is a simple one that has no easy answer, but that is worth sitting with when your moment arrives, and it always arrives. Which one will you be? If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who still believes the truth wins. Because it does. It just sometimes needs help finding its way home. If you believe that no one is above the law, not a badge, not a title, not 22 years on a small-town force, subscribe to our channel because we tell these stories every week, and we are not done yet.